Okay, so the push for net zero,
Yeah.
it's happening, right? But it's clear that not every sector can just switch to batteries.
Exactly. Think about the really heavy stuff. Global shipping, aviation.
Long-haul trucks, yeah, they're completely reliant on, well, energy-dense fuels, liquid, gas.
And if we want those sectors to hit net zero, we need a whole new source of fuel, carbon neutral fuel.
Right. Which brings us to today's deep dive. We're looking at a really fascinating piece of research, though it's getting a bit older now.
Yeah, it's from 2017.
The paper is titled, Long-Term Hydrocarbon Trade Options for the Maghreb Region and Europe. Renewable energy-based synthetic fuels for a net zero emissions world. Quite a mouthful.
It is, but it lays out the core idea. The mission here, as the study saw it back then, was to explore if producing these clean synthetic fuels in the Maghreb region.
So North Africa, Algeria, Libya, Morocco.
Exactly. Mauritania, Tunisia, Western Sahara too. Could they produce these fuels and export them to Europe? And could it be technically and crucially economically feasible by 2030, maybe 2040?
Yeah.
They were really looking for the least cost combination of renewable solar, wind to actually make this happen.
Let's jump right in then. Why the Maghreb? I mean, obviously it's close to Europe geographically, but what's the specific advantage? Why not build these plants, say, in Germany or somewhere?
It really comes down to the raw resources. The potential for solar and wind power there is just staggering.
Much better.
Oh, yeah. We're talking about vast areas of flat, sparsely populated land, some of the best solar irradiation on the planet, combined with really strong, consistent wind resources. The study actually modeled this in detail. They looked for the absolute best spots for hybrid PV wind power plants, places where you could maximize the operating hours.
And they found some sweet spots.
Definitely. Especially in places like Western Sahara, the potential there was, well, it was estimated to be around 7,000 full load hours per year for a hybrid plant.
Okay, hold on. 7,000 full load hours. Can you put that number into perspective for us? What does that actually mean?
Right. So a year has 8,760 hours. 7,000 full load hours means that for like 80% of the entire year, that combined solar and wind plant is predicted to be running at its maximum rated capacity.
Wow. Okay, that's almost continuous power from renewables.
Pretty close. And that's the key. Maximizing those full load hours is absolutely critical for driving down the cost of the electricity itself. The LCOE, levelized cost of electricity.
Because you're spreading the big upfront cost of the plant over way more hours of production.
Exactly. And cheap electricity is the fundamental ingredient for making these synthetic fuels affordable. Or more affordable anyway.
All right, so we've got this potential for super cheap, pretty reliable green electricity from the Maghreb. Now, how do we actually turn that into fuel? This is the power to X or PTX concept, right?
That's it, PTX. You're using renewable power to create something else, in this case, synthetic hydrocarbons. The study looked at two main routes, power to gas, PTG, and power to liquids, PTL.
And they mapped out the whole chain needed to make it work sustainably.
Yes, the whole value chain. So first, obviously the power source, those optimized hybrid PV wind plants using hour-by-hour data to model the output. Okay. Second, you need carbon. Since the goal is net zero, you can't use fossil carbon, so it has to come from the air. That means direct air capture, or DACE.
Ah, DAC, which is notoriously energy intensive, right?
Yeah.
Especially the heat needed.
It is, but here's where the system integration gets really smart in this study's design. The processes for making the synthetic fuels, the PTG and PTL steps, they actually release quite a bit of waste heat.
Okay.
So the model proposed capturing that waste heat and using it to meet the heat demand of the DE units.
Ah, I see. So you're kind of closing the loop, terminally
Right.
speaking, improving efficiency.
Precisely. It makes a big difference to the overall energy balance and ultimately the cost. It's a really key design feature they modeled.
And water. Deserts aren't exactly known for abundant fresh water, and you need water for electrolysis.
Good point. The plan relies on seawater reverse osmosis SWRO desalination plants located on the coast for easy access to seawater and also for shipping the final fuel.
Makes sense.
And another efficiency gain specifically for the gas pathway is that the methanation step actually produces water, which can then be recycled back into the system.
Okay, clever. So let's break down the two fuel types, power to gas, PTG. How does that work?
So PTG starts with electrolyzers using the renewable electricity to split water into hydrogen and oxygen.
Right.
That green hydrogen then reacts with the CO2 from the DAC units in a methanation plant. The output is renewable energy-based synthetic natural gas, RESNG.
Okay, synthetic methane, basically.
Exactly. And the cool thing is that SNG could potentially be injected directly into the existing natural gas pipelines that run from North Africa to southern Europe.
So, leveraging existing infrastructure.
For some markets, yes. But for places further away, like the study used Finland as an example, you'd need to liquefy it into LNG first, then ship it, which adds cost and energy use, of course.
Got it. Now, what about the liquids? Power to liquids, PTL? That sounds more complex.
It is a bit more complex chemically. It also starts with electrolysis to get hydrogen.
Okay.
But then, instead of just methanation, you have multiple steps. Typically, a reverse water-gas shift reaction followed by Fischer-Tropsch synthesis. These are well-known industrial processes, but stringing them together powered by renewables is the challenge.
And the output is?
Synthetic liquid fuels, SLF, things like synthetic diesel, jet fuel, naphtha. The study modeled a specific blend, 15% naphtha, 25% jet fuel, and 60% diesel.
So these are potentially drop-in fuels, meaning they could directly replace fossil fuels in existing engines.
That's the big appeal, yes. Especially for those hard-to-electrify sectors like aviation and shipping, clean, compatible fuels.
But there's always a cost to conversion. Energy is lost along the way. What did the study find about the overall efficiency? How much energy actually makes it into the final fuel?
Yeah, this is where you see the thermodynamic penalty. The electrolyzers are the big energy users. They consume something like 97% of the electricity in the PTG chain and about 93% in the PTL chain. Just turning water into hydrogen takes a lot of juice.
Okay, so if we put in, say, 100 units of renewable electricity, how many units of fuel energy come out the other end?
Well, the efficiencies calculated in the study weren't super high. For RESNG delivered by pipeline to southern Europe, the overall system efficiency was the best, around 63.7%.
So losing over a third of the energy right there.
Yep. And if you have to liquefy that SNG and ship it to northern Europe, like Finland, the efficiency drops further, down to about 57.4%.
Okay, and the liquid fuels, the PTL route.
Even lower. The overall efficiency for producing that synthetic liquid fuel blend was calculated at 51.5%.
Wow, so you're basically losing almost half the initial electrical energy.
You are. That's the trade-off. You're sacrificing a significant chunk of energy to get a fuel that's liquid, energy dense, and easy to store and transport for use in planes and ships. That lower efficiency is a fundamental challenge for the economics.
That definitely impacts the scalability. Speaking of scale, what kind of production potential did the study actually project for the Maghreb region?
Assuming they could use about 10% of the really suitable land area, the potential is huge. Algeria and Libya alone represented something like 73% of the total optimal capacity across the whole region. We're talking potentially massive amounts of fuel.
But I remember seeing something interesting in the outline about the type of fuel. The potential wasn't the same for gas and liquids.
That's right. It's a really important finding. Even though the PTL pathway produces that valuable liquid fuel, the study projected that the optimal installed capacity for PTL in 2030 would only be about 48% less than half of the potential for PTG, the synthetic gas.
Huh. Why is that? Why would the liquids pathway be so much more constrained in terms of potential scale?
It comes down to how the downstream chemical plants operate. The Fischer-Tropsch reactors and associated units for PTL, they really need to run continuously at a stable baseload. They don't like being ramped up and down frequently.
Okay. Unlike the power source, which is intermittent solar and wind.
Exactly. So to feed those steady chemical reactors from an unsteady power source, the PTL system needs massive amounts of hydrogen storage, like huge tanks or underground caverns to act as a buffer.
Ah, adding significant cost and complexity.
Right. That storage infrastructure adds a lot to the capital cost and limits how quickly you can scale up PTL compared to PTG. The PTG system, the methanation, is apparently a bit more flexible and can potentially be coupled more directly to the variable renewable power. It needs less intermediate storage to be viable.
So PTG is potentially easier to scale up initially, even if PTL makes the premium fuel. Interesting trade-off.
It's a key structural difference identified in the study.
Okay, we've covered the potential, the tech, the efficiency hurdles. Let's get to the bottom line, the cost. What did this 2017 study project for the actual price tag on these clean fuels, the levelized cost of fuel, or LCOF?
Right, the LCOF. In their base scenario, they assumed a weighted average cost of capital, or WACC, of 7%. That reflects, a fairly standard risk profile for a big new infrastructure project like this.
And for the cheapest location identified, which was Western Sahara.
For 2030, the projected minimum cost for RESNG was 76 euros per megawatt hour. For R diesel, it was a bit higher, 88 euros per megawatt hour.
Okay, 76 and 88 euros per megawatt hour in 2030. What about further out to 2040? Did they expect costs to drop?
Yes, significantly, due to expected technology improvements and learning curves. By 2040, RESNG was projected to fall to 66 euros per megawatt hour, and our diesel was projected to drop to 83 euros per megawatt hour.
Interesting. The S&G cost drops by about 13%, but the diesel only drops by around 5%. Why the bigger cost reduction for the synthetic gas?
The study attributed that mainly to projections for steeper cost decreases in the capital equipment for the PTG systems, specifically electrolyzers and the methanation units. They expected those components to get cheaper faster than the more complex Fischer-Tropsch parts of the PTL system.
I see.
Plus, as we discussed, the PDG pathway seemed better able to utilize those super high full load hours from the hybrid plants, which also helps bring down the cost per unit of fuel more effectively over time.
And underlying all this is the cost of the electricity itself. Did the study project much change there?
Yes, they did. They projected that the cost of generating power from, say, single-axis tracking PV could fall from around 20 euros per megawatt hour in 2030 down to just 15 euros per megawatt hour by 2040.
That's incredibly cheap power.
It is, but remember, that's the generation cost at the plant. The PTX facilities making the fuel are assumed to be on the coast for shipping, so you have to factor in transmission costs and losses to get the power there. So the actual delivered cost of electricity to the PTX plants was projected to be higher around 30 euros per megawatt hour in 2030, dropping to maybe 25 euros per megawatt hour in 2040. Still cheap, but not quite as low as the raw generation costs.
Okay, so even with falling costs, these synthetic fuels are still looking, well, pretty expensive compared to fossil fuels back in 2017 or even now. Which brings us to the crunch question. How could they ever compete? How do we get to fuel parity?
Exactly. Fuel parity. That's the point where the synthetic fuel costs the same as its fossil fuel equivalent. And the study was clear. Reaching parity requires more than just technology improvements. It requires policy and financial shifts.
Like what specifically?
Two main levers were analyzed. First, putting a price on carbon emissions from fossil fuels. The study looked at scenarios with CO2 costs rising potentially up to 75 euros per ton by 2040.
Okay, carbon tax or similar mechanism.
Right. And second, potentially creating a market for the oxygen that's produced as a byproduct during electrolysis. If you could sell that oxygen for, say, 20 euros per ton, that provides another revenue stream to offset the fuel production cost.
Interesting. So carbon pricing and oxygen sales?
Yeah.
What about the financial side? You mentioned the WACC earlier.
Yes. The weighted average cost of capital. This is huge. That base case 7% WACC reflects significant perceived risk, technological risk, market risk, maybe geopolitical risk given the region.
And higher risk means investors demand higher returns, driving up the project cost.
Precisely. So the study also modeled a best-case scenario where the project is significantly de-risked, perhaps through government loan guarantees or long-term purchase agreements from Europe. This could potentially lower the WACC to 5%.
And dropping the WACC from 7% to 5% makes a big difference.
A massive difference. For these incredibly capital-intensive projects, lowering the financing costs can actually reduce the final fuel price more dramatically than many technological breakthroughs. It's absolutely critical.
Okay, let's see the impact then. Base case first. 7% WACC. No CO2 cost. No oxygen sales. What kind of fossil fuel price was needed for these synthetics to compete back then?
It looked pretty bleak in that scenario, honestly. Based on the 2017 projections, RE diesel wouldn't reach parity until crude oil hit something like $169 per barrel in 2030.
Wow.
And RESNG was even worse, needing fossil natural gas prices equivalent to over $200 per barrel of oil. So clearly, without those policy and financial levers, it wasn't a viable business case.
Right. Now, the best case scenario. Low risk, so 5% WACC plus the CO2 tax, plus revenue from oxygen sales. How did the numbers change?
That's where things started to look potentially achievable. In that best case, RE diesel was projected to reach fuel parity when crude oil was at $101 per barrel in 2030.
Okay, still high, but getting closer to levels we've actually seen.
Exactly. And by 2040, in that best case, RE diesel parity was projected at just $83 per barrel.
$83. That sounds plausible. What about the synthetic gas, SNG?
SNG still needed higher prices. Parity was projected at 142 USD per barrel equivalent in 2030, falling to 107 USD per barrel in 2040 under the best case.
So even though the RE diesel is less efficient to make and costs slightly more per unit of energy than S&G,
Yeah.
it actually becomes competitive with its fossil equivalent, conventional diesel, at a much lower oil price. It seems like the better business case based on these numbers. Why is that?
It really boils down to market structure and the impact of the CO2 cost. Conventional diesel fuel per unit of energy is typically more expensive in the market than natural gas.
Right?
And crucially, burning conventional diesel releases more CO2 per unit of energy than burning natural gas. So when you slap on a significant CO2 tax, like 75 euros per ton.
The price of conventional diesel goes up much faster than the price of conventional natural gas.
Exactly. Which means its carbon-neutral synthetic replacement, the RE diesel, becomes competitive much sooner, even if it's slightly more expensive to produce than RESNG. The CO2 tax hits diesel harder, closing the gap faster.
That makes a lot of sense. So the PTL pathway, despite its lower efficiency and scaling challenges, looked like the more attractive immediate target for investment under those policy assumptions.
That was certainly the implication from the study's economic analysis back in 2017.
This has been really insightful, taking a detailed look back at how people were thinking about this challenge almost a decade ago.
And the core takeaway from the study remains pretty powerful, I think. It concluded that, yes, producing these carbon-neutral, sulfur-free synthetic fuels in the Maghreb is technically feasible, even by 2030, according to their timeline. But achieving market competitiveness hinges almost entirely on those external factors. You need strong policy, specifically, a meaningful cost applied to CO2 emissions, and you absolutely need financial de-risking to get that cost of capital down to something like 5%.
Right.
Without those, the economics just didn't work back then.
It underscores the strategic importance, though. Even if electrification takes over large parts of transport and heating, those niche sectors, aviation, shipping, will likely still need liquid or gaseous fuels for a long time. For sure.
And this study showed that the Maghreb region has the potential to be a major supplier of clean fuels for those specific European needs, potentially replacing some traditional fossil fuel imports.
It presents a clear pathway, technically at least.
Okay, so here's a final thought to leave you, our listener, with. Remember, this study, long-term hydrocarbon trade options for the Maghreb region and Europe, renewable energy-based synthetic fuels for a net-zero emissions world, was published back in 2017.
Ancient history in renewable energy terms.
Almost. Since 2017, the actual cost of solar PV, which is the absolute bedrock of this whole concept, has fallen much, much faster than almost anyone projected back then.
Dramatically faster.
So the question is, given those real-world cost reductions in solar that we've already seen in the last 7 years, how might those 2030 and 2040 cost projections look today? How much closer might we actually be to hitting that, say, $83 per barrel fuel parity point for RD diesel? Something to think about.
Definitely food for thought.
Thank you for joining us for this deep dive. We'll catch you on the next one.